Hey everyone, it's Glenn Greenwald back with a new episode of System Update here at our home on Rumble, and I want to explore a particularly surreal and twisted component of the still emerging controversy surrounding the efforts to coerce and pressure Spotify to remove the most popular podcaster in the United States, Joe Rogan. There are all kinds of aspects to this story that are worthy of commentary, and I wrote on my Substack an article that covered the aspect of it in which liberals are now completely obsessed with censorship as their go-to tactic for pretty much every part of their political agenda. Barely a week goes by, if it ever does, where there's not a new target that they are attempting to silence in some way, have banned from the internet, have content deleted, be deplatformed from a university, or fired. Every single week, there's a new one. They really just cannot abide any longer the fact that there are places where people who disagree with them, who see the world differently than they, have the freedom to express their views and to dissent from liberal pieties and orthodoxies. It's not only like it drives them crazy, it's like they genuinely believe as a religious conviction that they have the absolute right to prohibit and bar people from being heard who deviate from the foundational views of American liberalism. And this, obviously, this Joe Rogan controversy is just the latest in a very long line of examples demonstrating that. And one of the reasons it's so important to focus on is precisely because if they can do that to Joe Rogan, if they can successfully coerce and bully and pressure a large corporate giant like Spotify to silence the most popular podcaster in the United States with millions and millions of viewers, far more than any news person or political commentator on television. If they can do that to him, it means they can do that to anybody, that nobody is immune from these tactics. So for those who are interested, and I hope you are, in the genuine pathology in American liberalism, this incredible growing fixation with silencing everybody who disagrees with them, you could read my Substack article that I published over the weekend. I want to focus for the moment for this video on a separate component, which is the role that journalists are playing in this censorship binge in general and the Rogan controversy in particular. I talk to some degree in that article, and I have made video reports covering this issue before, that we have this extremely bizarre dynamic in the United States in which journalists who are supposed to be the leaders defending not just First Amendment rights of free speech and free press, but the values of free discourse and free inquiry. That's one of the reasons you go into journalism, is because you believe in that. But instead, our journalists, who are really more accurately described as employees of giant media corporations who call themselves journalists or whose job title is journalists, are leading the way in demanding censorship. It would be as if cardiologists were the leading activists urging people to smoke more or exercise less. Watching journalists take on the role of being the leading agitators for online censorship and increasingly offline censorship, like they're doing in the Rogan case and so many others, is incredibly pernicious. Just like it's pernicious to watch them be the leading proponents of prosecuting Julian Assange for breaking major stories and bringing transparency to the United States government, which is supposed to be their job. But journalism in the corporate world, in corporate media, is so inverted and so twisted and so distorted that those values that we have long associated with journalism are nowhere to be found. In fact, those are the values on which they most vigorously wage war. And they're doing that here in the Rogan controversy, where the overwhelming consensus of all the people in the good, prestigious, liberal corporate media, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Atlantic and the New Yorker and CNN and NBC, is that Joe Rogan is a menace because he spreads disinformation, a term that really doesn't have any concise meaning or any fixed meaning at all, which is what gives it so much power. Is its elasticity. But their consensus view is that he is a reckless commentator who's endangering people by spreading disinformation and therefore should be deplatformed. Is there a single politician of any national stature on the left or in American liberalism who has spoken out against big tech censorship in general or the effort to deplatform Joe Rogan? Tulsi Gabbard has, unsurprisingly, but she's long been expelled from the good, decent salons of liberal opinion. Marianne Williamson, to her great credit, who was a presidential candidate in the Democratic Party in 2020, also spoke out against the effort to deplatform Joe Rogan, but no elected official, not any centrists in the Democratic Party, not liberals in the Democratic Party, or even the vaunted squad or Bernie Sanders have nothing to say unless they're cheering this. And the argument that they're making, led by journalists, is that Joe Rogan needs to be censored, not because he's guilty of hate speech, but because he's spreading quote-unquote disinformation, which they never define. Now, I'm going to get to the specific claims about Joe Rogan in just a second. But the reason this is so notable is because there is nobody who spreads disinformation as aggressively, as toxically, as frequently, and as recklessly, as deliberately as the very outlets of the corporate media who are united now in denunciation of Joe Rogan. Watching these people at these media outlets pretend to be offended because Joe Rogan spreads disinformation when it's all they do, essentially, when that's their job title and their purpose, would be like watching neocons object to somebody and demand their deplatforming because they believe too much in war. That's how bizarre it is. So I just want to walk you through just how extensively the corporate media is drowning in disinformation, how aggressively and without consequence they disseminate disinformation to make clear how inane it is that they, of all people, are leading the way in maligning and disparaging Joe Rogan and demanding that he be deplatformed. Now, let's take a look, just to start off with, at this exciting new announcement that NBC News, their PR division, made just last week on January 28th, just a few days ago, where they very excitedly said that Stephen Hayes is joining NBC as a contributor and a political analyst. He will regularly appear across all NBC platforms, including the Today Show, Meet the Press, and NBC News Now, and contribute to the network's special political and election coverage. Very exciting. Stephen F. Hayes of The Dispatch has joined NBC News, arguably the most influential television outlet in the West, if not in the world. Who is Stephen Hayes? The person that NBC News, which claims to be against disinformation, has just hired and so proudly touted. Among other things, he's the author of this book, published in 2004, that purported to prove a non-existent alliance between Al-Qaeda on the one hand and Saddam Hussein on the other. An alliance which, according to the book title and cover, quote, endangers America. At the time, Stephen Hayes was with the Neocon Weekly Standard. He was one of Bill Kristol's closest comrades. This is one of the most destructive lies, one of the most destructive campaigns of disinformation in decades in the United States. Shortly or contemporaneously around the time that he published this book, polls showed that 70% of Americans, 7 out of 10, believe that Saddam Hussein was personally involved in the planning and execution of the 9/11 attack. And it was because pathological liars like Stephen Hayes were writing books and articles claiming, falsely, that Saddam Hussein had an alliance with Osama bin Laden. And Americans hearing that naturally would assume that Saddam Hussein must have planned the 9/11 attack. That's why these neocons lied this way and disseminated this disinformation. So how is it that you can work at NBC News, any of its properties, MSNBC, or anything else, and pretend to be against disinformation and think that you're combating disinformation when your own network just hired one of the worst and most shameful and discredited agents of disinformation over the last several decades in the United States? Right around the same time that Stephen F. Hayes, of NBC News, was writing that book based on an absolute lie, propaganda, the New York Times was publishing one article after the next, deceiving Americans into believing that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. A major cause of why so many Americans, not just conservatives, but liberals, ended up supporting the Bush-Cheney invasion of Iraq. Because the outlets they trusted, it wasn't Fox News convincing them, it was the outlets they trusted, like the New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, the columnists that they had like Tom Friedman, David Ignatius, the ones we were all supposed to trust, were telling them Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons and we had to go into Iraq. Here was from the front page of the New York Times, one of many of their notorious disinformation articles that read, quote, threats and responses, the Iraqis. U.S. says Hussein intensifies quest for A-bomb parts. And it talked about how Saddam Hussein was on the market for aluminum tubes that could only be used for a nuclear bomb. It was fed to them by Dick Cheney. That weekend, Dick Cheney went on Meet the Press when asked by then host Tim Russert of his proof that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. He said, well, I can't talk about it. It's classified information. But he pointed to the New York Times article that he himself had planted to tell Americans, don't worry, we have the definitive proof. They sent Robert Mueller and Michael Hayden, all of those people, to Congress to say the same thing, who now work in the very media outlets that pretend to be against disinformation. How can you work at this outlet or any of the other ones that did this, that started a war based on disinformation lies, and point to Joe Rogan and say he over there is the disinformation problem, when Joe Rogan never lied the country into war, never was part of a major disinformation campaign like these outlets not only were, but are purposely hiring people so they continue to be people who are known for and have great experience in being the most aggressive disinformation agents. Here was The Guardian from May of 2004 with the headline, New York Times admits failures in run-up to the Iraq War. And it talked about how so many of the articles that the New York Times published, as they were even forced to admit, ended up being complete full-scale propaganda. If you were somebody who was involved in this, you have no business pretending that you are opposed to disinformation or intent on combating it. Let's take a look at what NBC News did on September 11, 2018. I covered this little episode of disinformation in a separate video on Rumble. But just as a reminder, this was a story that they spread that we now know is false, about a supposedly secret weapon using extremely advanced technology that no one knew about that was harming the brains of American service members and people in the intelligence community. Watch what they told the American people.
Exclusive new reporting this morning from NBC News. Intelligence agencies investigating attacks on U.S. diplomats in Cuba and China now strongly suspect that Russia is to blame. 26 government workers in Havana had mysterious brain injuries starting in late 2016. And then this year, one U.S. worker in China was diagnosed with similar symptoms. Joining me now with more on this is NBC News intelligence and national security reporter Ken Delaney. And so
that Russia is to blame. They were ratcheting up war and tensions and hostility, blaming Russia for a weapon that we now know didn't even exist. Even the CIA and the FBI acknowledge that this is just mass psychosis. They had talked themselves into these symptoms because they were hearing these lying news outlets say it. How can you be somebody who works at that network who went on the air and they did the same thing with Andrea Mitchell on NBC News that night and say Russia is to blame for this weapon that didn't actually exist and for which there was never any evidence Russia did it, and pretend that you are upset by disinformation when nobody spreads it more than you? And then we have the queen of disinformation, the typhoid Mary of deceitful propaganda, Nicole Wallace, who spent 2003 and 2004 as the spokeswoman for the Bush-Cheney White House and then the Bush-Cheney re-election campaign. So you can imagine how many lies she told in that capacity. And now she tells lies in the same way. She just does it for the Democratic Party as a host at MSNBC, working for NBC. Listen to what she said on January 13th, 2021, less than a week after the riot at the Capitol, about Brian Sicknick.
I think what people are upset about is that they beat a Capitol Police officer to death with a fire extinguisher.
Now, she was far from the only one saying that. They were all saying that. And as you probably know, late in 2021, the medical examiner released his findings that concluded that Brian Sicknick, in fact, died of what they called natural causes. He was never touched with a fire extinguisher, let alone beaten to death with one. He went home that night on January 6th, spoke to his mother, said that he was fine, and died the next day in a way that the medical examiner said was natural causes. That, too, was a complete lie, and you can find so many of them like her on that network and so many others doing the same thing. Now, you probably have forgotten about this episode here, so I just want to quickly remind you, because it really vividly illustrates the absurdity of these outlets pretending that they're so offended by Joe Rogan's disinformation. A Twitter user had discovered old blogs that had been deleted that were written under the name Joanne Reed during the Obama years, a little bit before Obama became president, and during them, which were filled with vicious anti-gay bigotry. Just nasty, vicious, overt, explicit anti-gay bigotry. Now, when she was caught, she, of course, did the apology ritual, and she said, "I'm so sorry, I've evolved since then," which is fine. I wrote at the time, I think she should, like anybody else, not just liberals, but anyone on the right as well, who has said things that they no longer agree with, be given the space to grow and not have that held against them forever. We want people to change and abandon their bad views, and when they do that, they should be applauded, not punished for life. But then there were certain ones that were so noxious that I guess she just couldn't cop up to the fact that she had written them, and she claimed that there were some of the things being attributed to her on her blog that must have been written not by her, but by a hacker. And the reason that was so hilarious was because the Wayback Machine proved that the material was written way back in 2006 and 2007. So if it had been a hacker, it would have either had to have been somebody who knew that Joanne Reed one day was going to be somebody whose name we knew and hacked, even though at the time no one knew her for that reason, or was time traveling, had the ability to go back to 2006 and hack into her blog. So everyone knew this was a complete lie. She even claimed that the FBI was investigating to find the hacker. Everyone knows that she lied. Even CNN on April 28, 2018 had a headline that said, with an understatement, "Why MSNBC host Joy Reid's hacking claims don't add up." Do you know what happened? You know what NBC News did after Joy Reid got caught red-handed lying and fabricating this complex story about a hacker having written her bigoted post? They promoted her. She wasn't a primetime host back then. She hosted a daytime show. And they promoted her as the 7 o'clock show when Chris Matthews was fired for a whole string of inappropriate in the liberal minds comments. And they expressed at the time their corporate values, their news values, which is that you can get caught red-handed lying to the public and making up a story, and you still can be the host of an NBC show, just like Brian Williams at 11 o'clock was. His punishment for getting caught fabricating war stories was that he got the 11 o'clock show on NBC. This is the network pretending to be so alarmed by Joe Rogan's disinformation that they want him silenced and censored. Here's the CBS News article. Officer Brian Sicknick died of natural causes after defending the Capitol on January 6th, medical examiner says. Let's take a look at the next example from NBC News. This was the national security reporter Ken Delaney of NBC News, who had confirmed CNN's huge scoop from that morning that Donald Trump Jr. had early secret access to the WikiLeaks archive, which was a smoking gun proving once and for all that the Trump family had collaborated with WikiLeaks in advance to publish these emails. Listen to what he said.
That's right, Hallie. Two sources with direct knowledge of this are telling us that congressional investigators have obtained an email from a man named Mike Erickson. Obviously, they don't know if that's his real name, offering Donald Trump and his son, Donald Trump Jr., access to WikiLeaks documents. This was about September 2016, right in the middle of the campaign when WikiLeaks was putting out some documents, hadn't put out other documents. Remember, the Russians had hacked the Democrats and handed this.
That whole story was a complete and utter lie. And yet somehow CNN reported it first, claiming they had two sources. And then NBC News independently confirmed it with two sources. You just heard him say that. And as it turned out, this email to Donald Trump Jr. was written after WikiLeaks began publicly publishing those documents, not beforehand. The date on the email was after WikiLeaks told the world, not before. And it was just some guy from the public telling Donald Trump Jr., hey, I think you should take a look at these. These could be helpful to your campaign. It wasn't early, advanced, secret access like they said. This is what they swamped the airwaves with constantly. Joe Rogan didn't say that. Joe Rogan didn't say Brian Sicknick was beaten to death by Capitol Hill protesters with a fire extinguisher. Joe Rogan didn't say Russia was behind this secret weapon injury. They're the ones who said it, the people pretending to be worried about disinformation. Here's probably the worst one. On October 19th, 2020, Natasha Bertrand, who competes with Nicole Wallace, one of the few who can, for the title of Queen of Disinformation, published a story right after the New York Post had broken their big story about the emails from Hunter Biden's laptop showing that Joe Biden, the then Democratic frontrunner for president, was pursuing business deals in Ukraine and China, trading on his influence. Natasha Bertrand at Politico published a story saying that dozens of former intel officials say that it's quote-unquote Russian disinformation, which means two things. Number one, Russia is behind it. And number two, it's disinformation, meaning the documents are false. Both of those were complete lies. Russia had zero involvement in this, and the documents are completely true. This story, this fake false story, went everywhere, to every outlet that now is demanding Joe Rogan be censored because of disinformation. Not only did it go everywhere, but this was the lie that Facebook and Twitter used to censor the reporting of the story. The evidence that it was false, that this claim was false, that the documents were true, as I detailed in a lengthy Rumble video from a few months ago, emerged immediately. It was the reason why I was willing to write about these documents and quit The Intercept when they censored me. It was obvious from the beginning the documents were genuine. But a couple of months ago, a reporter, one of their own from Politico, Ben Schreckinger, published a book with ample evidence that the key emails were real, not disinformation, but were genuine and real. Not one of these media outlets went back and even acknowledged Ben Schreckinger's book. Politico did because it was their employee. They quickly, in passing, promoted the book. None of these media outlets admitted that they got caught publishing a CIA lie. They all united to ignore that book and pretend it never happened. So not only do they publish very damaging information on purpose to manipulate the outcome of an election, but when the evidence emerges that they lied, they just all join hands and refuse to acknowledge that evidence and retract their false story. This is supposed to be who you're supposed to believe is combating disinformation. Here is a Morning Joe segment from June 30th, 2020, that was about another CIA lie, this one laundered by the New York Times, that the Russians, again with Russia, had placed bounties on the heads of American soldiers, and Donald Trump was ignoring it because he was subservient to Vladimir Putin and obedient due to blackmail.
Well, news organizations continue to try to piece together what President Trump knew and when he knew it about the reported Russian bounty plot. Multiple organizations independently reported over the weekend that the U.S. has gathered intelligence that Russian intelligence officers have offered to pay bounties to Taliban fighters who kill Americans.
That whole story was a lie. Of course, we didn't hear that until after the election and Joe Biden was safely elected. Here's from the Daily Beast, April 15th, 2021. U.S. intel walks back claims Russians put bounties on American troops. They admitted they had virtually no evidence to support it. After the election was over. Before the election, every one of these media outlets was screaming up and down what you heard Mika Brzezinski just say, that the New York Times from the CIA claimed that the Russians had put bounties on the heads of American soldiers and Trump was ignoring it. One of the reasons these outlets are drowning in disinformation is because they purposely hire people whose only accomplishment in life is to lie to the public. I showed you before, they just got done hiring one of the worst liars, one of the most shameful and discredited neocons, Stephen F. Hayes. But look who else they hire. Here's NBC News with their national security analyst, John Brennan, formerly the director of the CIA. That's who they hire to tell Americans what's going on in the world. Brennan got caught lying about so many things: the number of civilians Obama was killing with drones, the fact that the CIA was spying on the Senate Intelligence Committee as it investigated the CIA for their torture program. They also hired James Clapper, President Obama's senior national security official, who got caught lying to the Senate when he claimed that the NSA does not wittingly or deliberately collect data on millions of Americans, something that Edward Snowden came forward and proved was a lie. He now works at CNN. This is who they put on. These outlets that are so deeply concerned about disinformation hire to tell you the news people who are trained disinformation agents. Here is Andrew McCabe, one of CNN's latest hires, who got fired by the FBI because he lied to the FBI about his role in leaks. Here is David Frum, the former Bush White House speechwriter in 2002 and 2003, responsible for so many presidential lies and so many lies over the years, who now is regularly on CNN and MSNBC. Here is his neocon comrade, Bill Kristol, same thing. Here from the Wrap in April of 2017 is this very exciting announcement that CNN, quote, has also announced 3 other hires on Monday. Former Homeland Security and Chief Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama, Lisa Monaco, has been brought on as CNN's Senior National Security Analyst. Former State Department and Pentagon spokesman John Kirby will be a CNN Military and Diplomatic Analyst. And 4-star General and former CIA Director Michael Hayden was named as CNN National Security Analyst. They just hire people right from these agencies, the deep state, the security state, that are trained liars. Michael Hayden was the head of the CIA for George Bush and Dick Cheney, and also on 9/11, the head of the NSA. This is who they're hiring to tell you the news while pretending that they are really upset by disinformation. Now, one of the things they'll say, if you show them all the lies they constantly tell, is, well, no, Joe Rogan lies about COVID, and that's particularly bad. Do you need to be shown all the evidence about how many times these same outlets have lied about COVID? Here on April 13th, 2020, CNN calling the people who believe that COVID came from a lab leak as opposed to a zoonotic natural evolution, quote, a conspiracy theory that's almost certainly not true. CNN in April 2020, when no one knew barely anything about the pandemic, declared it's not true that the virus came from a lab leak. 2021, Biden's elected. Everything's safe with the election. And even the Biden administration, according to BBC, admits they have no idea where the virus came from and therefore ordered an investigation into virus origin as the lab leak theory is debated. Even the Biden administration admits that CNN lied in early 2020 because the lab leak is a very viable theory. Here is CNN in March 2020 encouraging people not to wear masks unless they're symptomatic because, according to them, masks don't do anything, are not effective. Obviously, if you told people to wear masks back then, you would be banned from social media because you were guilty of disinformation. Now, if you say what CNN was saying in March of 2020, that masks don't work, you'll get deleted and banned and censored, as Dan Bongino just did on YouTube, because Google was angry that he made a video saying cloth masks don't work. Do you see the disinformation agents and the disinformation obsession that they constantly engage in, these same outlets? Here from December of 2021 was Joe Biden saying that the COVID vaccine stops the spread of the disease. People vaccinated for COVID-19 do not spread the disease to anybody else. That was repeated on every outlet. We know that's untrue. Remember when CNN depicted the high school senior, Nick Sandmann, as some sort of racist by lying about what he did, and then they and the Washington Post and so many others got sued and were forced to pay him money for the lies that were told. Now, the last way that they'll distinguish themselves from Joe Rogan is they'll say, yes, we lie constantly. We lie about all these things, including COVID, but we own up to our errors. That's what makes us journalists. As I showed you, that's totally false. So many of these lies were left standing. Sometimes they'll retract them when it no longer matters. But the one about the Hunter Biden emails being Russian disinformation, none of them have ever revisited that, despite a book proving that they lied. The one who actually does own up to his mistakes and immediately and quickly retracts and corrects them is named Joe Rogan. Here he is on September 18th, 2020, the day before he had a guest from the UK, Douglas Murray, on, and he had made a claim, Joe Rogan did, about the protest in Portland. Namely, he claimed that Antifa were going around lighting fires. He said that that was wrong. He went on to Twitter and said, I fucked up on the podcast. It turned out to be not true. I was very irresponsible, not looking into it beforehand. I repeated it. I read one story about a guy getting arrested for lighting fires, and he went on to say that was totally insufficient, and he apologized. Just this week, or I'm sorry, a couple weeks ago, January 14th, he had on a guest from Australia, and Joe Rogan made the claim that it's more likely that children will get myocarditis, the heart disease, from taking the vaccine than it is from COVID. In real time, that guest corrected him and showed him articles proving the opposite. A bunch of liberals laughed at it, spread the video around as though he'd be embarrassed by it. Joe Rogan himself went and posted the video to his 8 million followers. And he said, if anyone was going to make me look dumb on the podcast, I'm glad that it's Josh Zepps because I love him and he's awesome. However, this is why I was confused. And he explained the basis for his belief, citing a Guardian article that said that, but then admitted he was wrong. This is why people trust Joe Rogan and watch him by the millions, and nobody trusts MSNBC or CNN, very few people, because it's the opposite that's true. It's these outlets that are constantly spreading disinformation and refusing to own up to what they've done. They lie constantly. They lie repeatedly. They lie on purpose and by design. They drown the country in disinformation. Joe Rogan gets things wrong like we all do. But he does the sort of thing that is unimaginable for those other outlets, which is quickly and directly and unflinchingly admits when he gets things wrong, which is why he's built trust and faith with his audience. Now, the reason this is so fascinating to me is because these outlets love to whine and complain about the fact that people no longer trust them, that they go and get their information from people they regard as inferior, like Joe Rogan. But they never ask themselves, why is it that people are abandoning us? Why is it that people don't trust us any longer? And the fact that with a straight face, they can tell you that it's because Joe Rogan spreads disinformation, whereas they don't. They're real responsible journalists. When their record is so clear, they hire people who get caught lying like Joanne Reed and Brian Williams. They repeatedly spread outright lies on purpose that the CIA feeds them and then refuse to go back and correct them. Their whole history during COVID is getting one thing wrong after the next. When Substack was recently pressured about the fact that they allow writers to write about COVID in a way that liberals dislike, Substack very defiantly refused to deplatform them and said correctly, if anybody who was wrong about the COVID pandemic was barred from speaking, there'd be nobody left to speak. But these media outlets don't just get things wrong. They are by far the most frequent disseminators of disinformation. Disinformation does not come from QAnon or Facebook or Joe Rogan or other podcasts anywhere near in the same universe as it comes from these major media outlets. This is where the greatest amount of disinformation resides.